September 1944. You're in the Army Air Corps during World War II. If you were a bomber pilot in combat, your life expectancy during the war was 1 hour and 46 minutes. A fighter pilot was expected to live 19 minutes, but you're sitting in a Waco CG-4A glider. You have 17 seconds to live. You're flying behind enemy lines. You're falling through thin air.
The history of the military glider begins at the end of World War I. As the war drew to a close, 4 Allied representatives made their way to the Palace of Versailles in France to decide the fate of the Central Powers. In part, the treaty stated that Germany would take full responsibility for the war that killed 10 million people worldwide. Heavy restrictions were also placed on their armed forces, limiting their navy, army, and also including the sanction against any powered flight. Edward Mandell House, friend of President Woodrow Wilson, wrote in his diary about the negotiations, "I am leaving Paris after 8 fateful months with conflicting emotions. Looking at the conference in retrospect, there is much to approve and yet much to regret. It is easy to say what should have been done, but more difficult to have found a way of doing it. To those who are saying that the treaty is bad and should never have been made, and that it will involve Europe in infinite difficulties in its enforcement, I feel like admitting it."
Part of the terms of the Versailles Treaty were that Germany could no longer have a powered air force. They could no longer have powered planes. As Germany began to rearm itself, even in the 1920s when it was still the Weimar Republic, training in powered planes was forbidden, so the Germans turned to gliders to begin training their pilots.
In many ways, once Hitler came to power, they were planning long-term to totally ignore the Treaty of Versailles and rearm. So all across Germany in the 20s and especially in the 1930s, there were gliding clubs, and Germany was training thousands and thousands of young teenagers to be glider pilots, sport glider pilots like we still have today.
Later in 1938, Germany and Italy both, as a step towards training more pilots and towards militarization, started their version of what was known as the Civilian Pilot Training Program. And they were able to then train many, many more pilots in what technically was a civilian capacity, pilots who also, of course, took training in gliders and sailplanes.
During World War I, Luftwaffe General Kurt Student forced a French fighter plane to land behind German lines. He took the plane, re-equipped it with a machine gun, and took it back into combat. After the war, Student, along with Hermann Goering, were steadfast in their efforts to make sure German military aviation did not become obsolete. He attended the Red Army Air Force maneuvers in Moscow. It was there where Student first saw the canvas and wood military glider. He reported to Goering and his superiors in Germany that they must pursue a military glider program.
There was always, right from the beginning of the air age, the idea of the glider was definitely in play. The idea of using gliders for military purposes dates from the period after the First World War. The First World War, of course, was trench warfare. It was really hard to attack fortified positions, so people had the idea of trying to get troops across the fortified positions, and almost at the same time you get the idea of paratroops, and you get the idea of using a glider to carry troops across enemy fortifications.
The CG-4A, because it is so large, has a steel tube frame, kind of like a truss frame, in the central section. And the nose section is also a steel tube frame, and it lifts up to get in and out, to get things in and out of it. Other than that, it's a wooden frame over that, and then canvas stretched over all the wood frame parts. So it is essentially a giant Piper Cub that is basically a canvas and wood aircraft.
So these are very durable, strong aircraft, but also very lightweight. The Waco CG-4A glider was the third most produced aircraft of World War II.
The glider is towed into battle on the end of a nylon rope by a larger plane, usually the C-47. They are towed near a landing zone and then released. The glider then swoops into the landing zone and unloads troops and cargo. If their mission is a success, they are then picked back up in a snatch operation in which the glider is plucked from the ground using a hook from a bomber and nylon ropes attached to the glider.
For the gliders, the real use, the real premium value of the gliders in the war was the ability to deliver 13 combat-ready troops in one location at once, instead of having them scattered all over the place as parachutists often did.
Hermann Goering, a fighter pilot for Germany during World War I, joined the Nazi Party in 1922. It was he who wrote the proposal for the German glider program and its role in re-establishing the German Empire. Of Goering, Hitler said this: "I gave him a disheveled rabble, and in a very short time he had organized a division of 11,000 men." Germany would prove to the world the strength of the military glider and its ability to strike silently and efficiently behind enemy lines. Hey guys, I'm here at the Science Spectrum. We are at the Texas Film Hall of Fame Award. Today, we're at Star Comics in Lubbock.
I'm definitely looking forward to the Avengers though.
Well, Batman's okay, but he doesn't have any superpower.
It has like a lot of like action. I'm a really like into action kind of chick, so I want to see the Amazing Spidey.
What? He's like, let her go.
Basically Avengers and Dark Knight Rises.
Reagan, keep that camera rolling.
What kind of place was this where children couldn't go outside? Where the air itself could kill you? Where the sky showered down this suffocating blackness that could erase the sun at midday?
Fort Ibani Mile sits quietly on the edge of the Albert Canal at the junction between the Belgian, German, and Dutch borders. Using their experience after World War I, new technologies and ideas were implemented in the creation of the Belgian fort to fortify a compact ensemble of gun turrets and observation posts surrounded by a defended ditch. Ibani Mile was one of the most secure fortresses in the world, or so they thought. On May 10, 1940, an assault consisting of 78 paratroopers and 9 gliders assaulted the fort on direct orders from Adolf Hitler. The Belgians were caught by complete surprise. The Germans quickly disabled the fort's turrets in only a matter of minutes.
So they used a very well-timed, stealthy operation with gliders. The Germans had combat gliders or cargo gliders, and they landed several small teams of German special ops troops, for lack of a better term, and they were able to, with the use of some modern explosives, which hadn't been tested before either, some very high-powered explosives, were able to neutralize and capture that fort in about an hour. And so that caught everybody's attention worldwide. And we were not in a war yet, but we were watching what was going on. And the German, that caught everybody's attention when they were able to use gliders so successfully.
On May 10th, 1940, Fort Eben-Emael, which was located on the frontier in Belgium, the Belgian-German frontier, was captured in just a few hours by German glider troops. The fort was considered impregnable. It was a very strong fortress with very large heavy artillery pieces, many machine guns and so forth, but all of which were trained to defend against land forces attacking it from a distance, infantry and tanks attacking it on the ground from a distance. The Germans once again found a loophole. They found a way of getting around this. They simply landed their gliders on top of the fort.
Around the world, military officials took note. Many could not believe that such a small glider force could overwhelm what was thought to be an impregnable fortress. On June 22, 1940, Winston Churchill wrote a memorandum to the War Office asking them to investigate the possibility of creating a glider force of 5,000 men. As the British military scrambled to gain ground on the Germans, Hitler continued his march through Europe. His next target was the Greek island of Crete. On Crete, he would once again use Germany's glider power to surprise the Allies, only this time he would pay a heavy price in doing so.
In I I guess it would have been the summer of 1941, the Germans conquered the island of Crete in the Mediterranean. And the very first parts of that operation involved the use of thousands of glider troops brought in by hundreds of gliders. And once again, the operation was successful. There were very high casualty rates, which the Germans never told anybody about. But nevertheless, they were successful. That really convinced the United States Army to launch a glider program of its own. We might not have done that had we known what the casualty rates that the Germans suffered were, but nevertheless we did.
If the world had any doubts about that, it was certainly proven by the Germans in a campaign to capture the island of Crete in the Mediterranean in 1940. They used paratroops, they used gliders, and they were able to overcome a numerically superior British force defending the island of Crete. And so even before the United States went into the war, the people who were really paying attention in the United States military knew the practicality of the glider.
In 1941, in April of 41, gliders once again came to the forefront of military knowledge and praise throughout the world when the island of Crete in the Mediterranean was captured entirely by airborne troops. And the airborne troops who landed by parachuting glider. They captured an airfield there on the island of Crete and were able to overwhelm the British defenders, who actually outnumbered them, were able to overwhelm the British defenders and capture the entire island. This was the first time in military history that an entire military operation had taken place by airborne troops only, by parachutists and gliders only, and it was quite an amazing event. The fighting was very intense. The British inflicted serious casualties on the German parachutist and glider troops who landed, so much so that Hitler decided, unbeknownst to the Allies, that he was canceling all future glider operations, that he decided that glider and parachutist operations were just too dangerous and so forth, and that it created too many casualties for the German troops. So he had actually canceled his glider operations for the rest of the war, deciding it was too dangerous. The Allies were not aware of this. So the Allies continued pursuing their glider operations and decided that that was going to be a very effective weapon in all battles in the future in World War II.
Henry Arnold was an American general and an aviation pioneer. Arnold's primary nickname, Hap, was short for Happy, attributed to work he did moonlighting as a stunt pilot, but he was called Harley by his family during his youth and Sonny by his mother. He was known to his West Point classmates as Pute or Benny. To his immediate subordinates and headquarters staff, he was referred to as the Chief. He was taught to fly by the Wright brothers and was one of the first military pilots the world had ever seen. He was the second highest rated pilot in the history of the U.S. Air Force. Hap created the American Glider program in February of 1941. 10 months before the U.S. would officially enter the Second World War.
The first milestone, obviously, was the decision to go forward with it. There was debate whether or not it was going to work, whether or not it would be successful. But the general in charge of the Army Air Corps was a general named Hap Arnold. And he was convinced from what he'd seen from the German operations and what he knew actually of the Russian operations, because the Russians were also using them simply to shift troops and cargo very successfully. They never had any operations based on the glider, but he felt like it was something we needed to do.
All major powers in World War II used gliders at one point or another. The Russians, the British, the Americans, the Japanese, the Italians, they all used gliders.
We intended for many of our military operations to have a large airborne component, paratroopers, landing behind lines. That wasn't feasible without a way to supply. So, it was one of those things, one led to the other. We're going to use airborne operations. We've got to have a way to resupply. The most accurate way we can think of, as far as we're concerned, is a glider, to put troops and material where we need it accurately. So, all of those things together led to the creation in the summer of 1941 of the glider program, and then the training of the first round of glider pilots at Elmira, New York.
11 companies were asked to build prototypes of gliders. Only 4 showed interest, and only 1 submitted anything. The Waco Aircraft Company was founded in 1919 at Troy, Ohio, when businessmen Clayton J. Bruckner and Elwood Junkin met barnstorming pilots Charlie Myers and George Weaver. During the war, Waco built the 8-seat CG-3A and the 15-seat Waco CG-4A glider. The CG-4A was the third most built aircraft in America during World War II.
Tell him what's in your heart.
That's all ahead on tonight's News Hour.
Let's go!
Hang on!
Would have missed this for the world.
There's nowhere you can run. It's as if it follows you, follows you, follows you. You can't escape it. It carried a feeling of almost being evil.
You are watching KTTZ TV, Channel 5, Lubbock, Texas, part of Texas Tech Public Broadcasting.
Construction of the gliders, using the glider program, was as chaotic as the training part of it. Nobody who was building aircraft for the military could participate unless they were so big that it wouldn't hold back their operations. So to find people to build the gliders, they had to use non-traditional sources and some traditional sources. Small airplane, private airplane makers like Cessna, Waco. Waco designed it, then they got to build some of them. Piper built some. Ford Motor Company built a lot of them. But other companies that had never built airplanes were doing this. And one of those companies was in St. Louis.
In 1926, after securing a federal airmail contract, the Robertson Aircraft Corporation out of St. Louis, Missouri took its first delivery. The pilot was Charles Lindbergh. Robertson Aircraft Company was founded by brothers Bill and Frank after World War I. In 1942, as part of the war effort, Robertson was contracted by Waco Aircraft Company to build the CG-4A glider.
But certainly gliders had their dangerous side to them as well. A very serious, tragic accident occurred in St. Louis, Missouri in 1943, in which the mayor of St. Louis and a general and several other dignitaries died in a glider crash in front of a large field of personnel and so forth, in front of a large crowd.
They were having a publicity show, an air show, and showing off the glider, and the mayor of St. Louis and a number of local dignitaries were in a CG-4A built by the company in St. Louis that was building them. And they were flying at about 1,500 feet over the airport. The crowd was watching and cheering and clapping, and a wing fell off. And the thing crashed, and they all died. And that was a bad thing for the glider program. People were questioning the safety and the viability of the glider after that.
They thought about shutting down the glider program. But then we put on an air show at Laurinburg-Maxton and invited all the generals and the big shots down and convinced them that the glider was safe and that it was a good tool to use during the war.
The crash was the worst air disaster in the history of St. Louis. At a press conference shortly before the flight, Mayor William D. Becker was asked about his belief in the safety of air travel and the amount of danger involved in riding in a glider. His response was, "You can die only once, and we must die sometime." The glider had made several successful passes as the crowd looked on cheering. Immediately after it was released from its tow cable, the right wing fell off and the glider plummeted to the ground. There were no survivors. This setback was not enough to stop the U.S. military from pursuing a successful glider program during the war. The race to keep up with the Germans was very much a concern, and successful glider units were exactly what the military needed. They expanded the program to 40 different bases and airfields around the country.
When they began the program, there were 40 bases scattered, like I said, from basically almost from coast to coast. The problem developed fairly quickly that you had 40 bases trying to do everything that was required in the program, sort of like in a vertical. Well, you had to have ground training, you had to have basic training, primary training, dead stick training, then you had to finally move to the big CG-4A glider. You didn't have logistically enough CG-4As in the first place to supply 40 bases with trainers, because they were finding out that the CG-4A, which was designed for a one mission lifespan, was not suited for being flown and landed repeatedly all day long. So they had to have a better use of those. So they decided, in early 43, after about 6 or 8 months of chaos, in about February of 43, the Army decided that, okay, let's just put all the advanced training in one place and everybody will feed into one base. And that base turned out to be South Plains Army Airfield. So that to fly the big CG-4A after February, March of 1943, you had to go through Lubbock.
They closed all the glider pilot training facilities around the country and brought us all into Lubbock to one central training station.
Lubbock played a very important role in aviation training in World War II. The largest advanced glider training base, South Plains Army Airfield, was located here in Lubbock, and over 4,200 glider pilots graduated from SPAF, as it was known, during the war. Certainly there were other advanced glider bases around the country. 2 were at close by. One was in Fort Sumner, one was in Dalhart, but Lubbock by far and away had the largest number of pilots graduate from this location. The impact of South Plains Army Airfield economically was over $5 million on the Lubbock economy, which was an enormous amount of money in those days. And it was located here through a series of political maneuverings by the former manager of the Lubbock Chamber of Commerce, Mr. A.B. Davis, and by Lubbock's congressman in those days, George Mahon. They worked feverishly, not only during the early part of the war, but primarily starting back in the early 1930s, to have the U.S. Army Air Forces locate an air base, an airfield here in Lubbock.
The South Plains of West Texas was the perfect place for the glider program to take flight. It offered wide open spaces, warm weather, mostly clear skies, and goodwill in the local community. The climate created conditions of upward air currents and relatively little low cloud formations, both conditions essential in gliding.
Lubbock obviously had huge advantages. The flying weather was spectacular. Most of the year you got good flying conditions. Springtime was a little bit problematic for testing and working on glider preparations because of the wind. But because it had so much open space and because the weather was decent most of the year, that was one of the reasons why it was selected.
No, it was a different experience up here, because coming from New Jersey, come out here and I look and I see the barracks and these ropes are hanging down from the eaves of the barracks. I said, what's that for? Well, when you hear the siren, it means the wind's going to blow, you go out and tie the roofs down. And they actually did that.
Certainly one of the things was the fact that Lubbock was willing to lease the Lubbock Municipal Airport for $1 a year to the Army Air Force.
Hot, dry, windy, all those and above. It was a small town. I never really got a chance to know too many. I did date a girl at Shepherd Field in Wichita Falls, but I don't remember any activity. I was busy learning to fly gliders. When I couldn't wait to graduate so I could get myself overseas and become a hero.
That wind would change. It had been known to change from the time you did on a 270 approach, from the time you cut loose till you made your base leg, the wind was behind you. And that would blow you guys would clear down to the other end of the field, or sometimes over a nut into a cotton patch out there or something.
78 out of those 150 air bases that were opened during World War II, about 78 of them were located here in Texas. And from what I've seen, Roughly well over half of them are located in West Texas.
First started way off, and when it hit, it was just like midnight. Middle of the day was just like midnight, with no stars, just dark. Scared us to death.
Hey guys, I'm here at the Science Spectrum. We are at the Texas Film Hall of Fame Award. Today, we're at Star Comics in Lubbock.
I'm definitely looking forward to the Avengers, though.
Well, Batman's okay, but he doesn't have any superpower.
It has like a lot of like action. I'm a really like into action kind of chick, so I want to see the amazing Spidey.
What? He's like, let her go.
Basically Avengers and Dark Knight Rises.
Reagan, keep that camera rolling. Although they had centralized the Advanced Glider program to Lubbock, the training was still very chaotic. Because the glider was a brand new weapon, the best ideas on how to utilize the glider would change on a moment's notice. The training regiment was tough. Flying at night was common, and being blown by the West Texas wind into surrounding cotton fields was an everyday occurrence. The main goal at South Plains Army Airfield was to give the cadets a well-rounded knowledge of glider flying. Some pilots took it upon themselves to make life more interesting at the base. Cadets were divided into pools, and when needed by the military, many were allowed to graduate. Other times, when they were saturated with cadets, there would be lots of washouts.
They kept changing their trainings. See, the original training was come in hot and fast, get on the ground in a hurry. Well, that's the worst thing you can do with a loaded glider, particularly when you have a lot of gliders landing in the same field. So they came out with new techniques, and that's one of the things we learned at Laurinburg-Maxton. Come in what they call a high nose slip left, and you lose altitude like an elevator, and then when you recover, it's just in time to land.
They had them scattered all over because it's a comparatively new program, in fact, a real new program, and they didn't know what to do. It changed from day to day what the requirements were and what the program was. And I know the first time I came here, you had to make certain kinds of landings. Blitz landings, they call them, where you stuck down and tried to get down on the ground as fast as possible. And the next time I came around, no, it's so slow, and you're just above stalling speed, 50 miles an hour. And so the program changed all the time, and when they needed glider pilots, boy, most anybody could get through the program. When they didn't need them, there was lots of washouts.
At SPAF, South Plains Army Airfield, since it was chosen to be the only advanced training base, the mission it had to fill was to teach pilots to fly the CG-4A, the big glider, after they had moved up from smaller gliders and other training programs. So the typical pilot would come to South Plains Army Airfield, spend about 6 weeks, and they had a certain number of landings they had to make, because the critical thing they had to know how to do two things: follow along on the end of a tow rope behind a C-47 and then land. And those were the two primary things they had to be able to do. And they would just land day and night. They had them landing 24/7, daylight, dark, practice a lot of dark landings, night landings. After their 6 weeks, if they'd done the number of landings that they were supposed to do, and they took one last check flight with their instructor, and if they passed that, then they were moved on to North Carolina for what they call tactical training, which they learned to fly with other gliders in the air at the same time in formation and doing mock training exercises and that kind of thing.
Different tactics, we had triple toes, double toes, single toes, how different loads, because you might carry, like they have in there, a 37mm anti-tank gun, or a small bulldozer, or 12 troops.
Now, the one thing I remember about Lubbock was this: we were getting behind our schedule, and we had to get graduated by a certain time, and we needed a certain number of hours to qualify, a certain number of landings to qualify. So they said, well, in order to accelerate this program, what we're going to do is some emergency takeoff maneuvers. I said, what is that? Well, what you do, you do a normal takeoff, and the moment you get enough altitude that you're high enough at the end of the runway, you do a wing over, reverse your direction, so U-turn, and come back and land downwind. You can do that in 5 minutes. So we were logging 5-minute missions to get a landing, to help get us through the program by September the 14th, the graduation date. That's what I remember about Lubbock.
Well, we had a certain number of students. I mean, you knew who they were, and you had a program so much flying. They had so much ground school, so much flying, so much radio, and we just had flying part of it. And so we'd be on the flight line all the time, sitting around drinking coffee mostly and smoking. You know, one of those terrible things you did. But you had a set routine. I mean, you had day flying, you had night flying, you had cross-country type flying, and you had a lot of pattern flying, different releases at night, sometimes low, sometimes high. They might cut you loose at 5,000 feet at night, and you know, you made 180 traffic patterns, 360s. You had a regular routine that you went through.
The glider cadets came from many different walks of life. Some were proficient in flying as civilians, while others had never flown in their entire lives. Because flying the glider was such a dangerous task, many of the glider pilots were men who originally wanted to fly bombers or fighter planes. Others just wanted the opportunity to take the fight overseas and help their country. Whatever their reasoning, and no matter where they came from, the men all got along.
It's a sad way to put it, but that's really realistically the way to say it about glider pilots, is that if they had had their druthers, they would have been flying B-17s, they would have been flying B-24s, so they had to have the technical skills that a pilot possesses, but it was things like eyesight that washed them out of the program, maybe inability to compute navigationally, that would wash you out of a fighter pilot program, and yet the need was there for glider pilots. So since you had some capability in that regard, but not the total package, you were shifted over to fly gliders.
Nobody claimed us. I mean, the Air Force didn't claim us, and the Airborne Infantry wouldn't claim us, you know, and so we were sort of bastard children, is that the expression? Polite expression? That wasn't what a lot of them called us, but it's a... so we sort of had to hang together because there's nobody else to hang with.
They've used glider pilots who were not qualified to be power pilots because of age. See, glider pilots could enlist up to age 32, whereas 26 was the limit for cadet. So we were misfits. We were actually second-class citizens. Matter of fact, the power pilots a lot of times looked down upon us because they thought we were all washed-out cadets, which is, some did, but not all of us. I never was a cadet. I couldn't pass the eye test. so there was, and yet we were qualified to fly co-pilot on the C-47s. We were qualified to fly solo in any aircraft under 650 horsepower.
Misfits, unfit for powered flight. Well, that might be what the military thought of the glider cadets. They knew if given a chance they could serve their nation and prove their courage all the same. The glider pilots rallied around each other. At SPAF, they grew victory gardens, had a football team that battled against smaller universities in Texas, and also formed their own Bugle Corps band. If they were going to spend their days and nights flying, they were also going to find time to entertain themselves. The citizens of Lubbock took pride in having the cadets in their town. If a cadet needed a ride, he was picked up by a local. If a cadet wanted to go to church, the churches would come to them. If the strength of the United States during World War II was patriotism and camaraderie, then Lubbock was a shining example.
Relations were very, very good. There were events held at the base, open to the public. There were anniversary events where thousands and thousands of people would come from Lubbock to attend the open day, I guess you could say, where they could come in onto the base. They did that twice, and the governor of Texas even attended those.
Well, we got out here and hitchhiked, you know, and then sometimes they had a GI bus that would take you in, and we went to Broadway drugstore, because you could dance in the basement. And that was 1942, that's where I met my wife. They had a dance in La Mesa, and she came home from Tech to go with that thing, see, and we got married. I graduated in March, and we got married in May of '43.
There were certainly reports from World War II veterans I've interviewed, such as James Fagan, who was living on the Tech campus at the time in West Hall, and he was in the civilian pilot training program, Texas Tech pre-flights program. He can recall very clearly images of many C-47s towing Waco CG-4A gliders all throughout the skies, north and in different directions around Lubbock.
Like I said, there wasn't a lot to do, but one thing I'll say, and I'm sincere in this, that the people in Lubbock were about the most friendly that we had seen anywhere.
We would go off Amarillo and bring hooch back in the gliders, and or go to San Antonio. And let's see, I think I was here when we had to, see another thing, we had to go through high altitude training. You know, yeah, you go through high altitude training. We went back there, and we went down to San Antonio and went through that high altitude chamber, and we're coming back here, and I had 2 bottles of whiskey, and we had Class A uniforms on, you know, all that stuff. And we had trouble. It was a C-18, one of those old twin-engine airplanes, and we were having trouble. So the pilot said, well, we may have to jump, you know, and some of the guys got ready to jump, and I got to thinking, well, how am I going to jump and hold on to this?
Tell him what's in your heart.
That's all ahead on tonight's NewsHour.
Let's go!
Hang on!
Would have missed this for the world.
You are watching KTTZ TV, Channel 5, Lubbock, Texas, part of Texas Tech Public Broadcasting.
The true test of the glider program would come on June 6, 1944 during Operation Neptune. Neptune was codenamed for the air operations and first phase of the invasion on the beaches of Normandy in France. The glider's objective was to land behind the German lines and attack the resistance to the Allied forces invading the beaches. Missions Chicago and Detroit were pre-dawn glider landings involving 52 Horsa and Waco CG-4A gliders carrying troops and heavy guns. Chicago was an unequivocal success, landing 92% of its gliders within 2 miles of the landing zone. By the time Mission Detroit was launched, the clouds had rolled in and visibility was near 10%. Only 62% of the Detroit gliders landed near their targets. 5 gliders cut loose in the clouds and remained missing for months.
The glider was part of a bigger operation. It was simply a part of the big airborne operations that were going to be used and were used during World War II. And the first really big test of the glider was at D-Day at Normandy in June of 1944.
However, the Allies decided to continue pursuing glider operations, and the glider drop into Normandy on the night of June 5th, June 6th, 1944 was a very successful operation. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, along with the British 6th Airborne Division, also known as the Red Devils, landed in a massive operation all throughout the Normandy area, primarily around Caen, northeast of Caen, around Benneville-Ranville area. And in the American sector, the 82nd, 101st landed between Utah Beach, Saint-Mary-Glisse, and Carentan, all in that area there.
89% of the horses and 50% of the CG-4As crashed upon landing during the invasion of Normandy. Regardless of those numbers, 75% of the weapons and soldiers were ready for combat and played a significant role in the successful Allied invasion.
The mission of the glider was to accompany paratroopers. Paratroopers would go in, and not very far behind you would have the glider stream, and it might be, well, at Normandy there were 900 gliders full of either troops or jeeps and cannons and whatever. They would go into landing zones, which theoretically had been cleared by the paratroopers shortly before they got there. And they would unload their cargoes, which could be used by the airborne troops. So that the airborne operations could not succeed. They were always behind enemy lines. They had to be resupplied very quickly. The glider allowed that to happen instantaneously almost. The troops got down, cleared the ground, jeeps, tanks. Well, even the British had a glider that would carry a tank. Supplies to allow them to do their mission would be there very quickly.
The Allies continued to push the German forces back. By August of 1944, the Germans had retreated across the Low Countries and eastern France toward the German border. In September, the Allies would launch the largest airborne operation in history to strike at the heart of the industrial center of Germany. Operation Market Garden was an ambitious plan, but one that the Allies believed would be successful.
As for the glider operation specifically in Market Garden, once again there were large numbers of gliders used by the Allied forces. Their job was to take and hold a series of 5 bridges. Once those 5 bridges had been captured, then the British 30th Armored Division would then race up a series of highways which those bridges connected, and once they reached Arnhem, they would be able to travel across that bridge, across the Rhine River, and into the Rhine, the Ruhr Valley of Germany, thus capturing the German industrial heartland and hopefully bringing the war to an end by late September, early October of '44.
Between June 6th and August 14th, the German forces were decimated. 23,019 had been killed in action, 198,616 had gone missing, and 67,410 had been wounded. The Germans, in their retreat, were bombed relentlessly by both the British and American forces. Yet near the German border, they would make their final stand. The Allies believed that the Germans were on the run and in a state of chaos, panic, and defeat. The Germans, however, were digging in at Arnhem. Their spirits were soon bolstered by the arrival of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which consisted of the 9th SS and the 10th SS Panzer Divisions. If the Allies were going to cross the Rhine and make their way into Germany, they were going to have to fight tooth and nail, inch by inch.
I was overloaded, and instead of coming in and being able to land at 60 to 65 miles an hour, I was almost stalling at 85. So I was moving when I cut loose and it came in to keep from stalling. And I remember very distinctly, I hit a fence. And I bet I don't know how much fence I pulled up. I caught the fence with the runners, with the skids on the front. And bouncing across these terraces, everything was pretty good except for a few holes in the glider from ground fire. And I just about had it stopped, and I came up on another big drainage ditch, and I had just enough airlift to barely get me, I didn't get all the way across. One wheel got up and the other wheel dropped down and caught the side of the ditch, and it ground looped us. And I don't know whether that's bad or good, because we bailed out right into that ditch because they're shooting at us.
The gliders carried out their same type of operation as they did in other locations, delivering troops and material behind enemy lines, so that when the German forces counterattacked, they would be able to hold the bridges that were designated for them to hold, and be able to stop German counterattacks long enough for the British 30 Corps. I thought I said 30th Armored Division was 30 Corps, British 30 Corps, to race up this series of connected highways and make it to Arnhem.
The opening day of the operation was defined by Allied success. Almost all of the troops arrived at their drop zones without incident. In the south, the 101st Airborne captured 4 of the 5 bridges. However, as the Allies advanced, communication became a problem. The Germans began to fight back, and radio malfunctions hindered the Allies from calling in air support. Because of his knowledge of the local geography, German Field Marshal Walter Model quickly realized the Allied strategy and immediately began moving his troops into defensive positions. The next 3 days were marked by terrible foggy conditions, once again to the benefit of the local Germans and the hindrance of the Allied air support.
As a matter of fact, that I was with the 61st Troop Carrier Group at the time, and my group was supposed to fly across the Rhine and land on the other side. But at the last minute, they changed plans and moved us back to Arnhem, and the British went across the Rhine. What happened was that they got too far off from their LZs, or landing zones and drop zones, as much as 15 miles away, which was a disaster.
The British troops were cut off from supplies and support. They continued to suffer heavy losses. On the 8th day, the 101st Airborne was ordered to withdraw from across the Rhine. Of approximately 10,600 men, 1,485 had died, 6,414 were taken prisoner, of which 1/3 had been wounded, and 2,398 successfully made it back to Allied positions.
Most critics claim that Market Garden was mostly a failure, especially for the British troops who landed at Arnhem, because there was a German division, I believe it was the 12th SS Panzer Division, was located there at Arnhem, unbeknownst to the Allies, to Allied intel. It had been located there just recently for, in effect, for R&R, had been taken off the line. And the British 6th Airborne Division landed very close by, and then suffered serious losses. I believe out of the roughly 10,000 men in the British 6th Airborne Division, only 2,000 of them made it out.
Looking back, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery said this: "It was a bad mistake on my part. I underestimated the difficulties of opening up the approaches to Antwerp. In my prejudiced view, if the operation had been properly backed from its inception and given the aircraft, ground forces, and administrative resources necessary for the job, it would have succeeded in spite of my mistakes, or the adverse weather, or the presence of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps in the Arnhem area. I remain Market Garden's unrepentant advocate." In March of 1945, the Allied forces would finally make their push across the Rhine. By this time, the German forces on the Western Front had dwindled. Montgomery now commanded 30 divisions, while only 10 units remained on the German side. What the Allied forces had failed to do in 8 days, they would now accomplish in 1 during Operation Varsity. Unlike Market Garden, the airborne forces would be dropped only a relatively short distance behind German lines, thereby ensuring that reinforcements in the form of Allied ground forces would be able to link up with them within a short period. Gliders once again were the preferred method of troop and supply distribution. The Air Armada during Operation Varsity stretched over 200 miles in the sky.
I was number 3 out of the echelon of 4. We went into the target zone, 4 gliders following 4 tow planes, and ahead of that was another set of 4, another 4. The way the 4 echelon in my group was, number 1 carried a Jeep, number 2 carried a gun, either an anti-tank or a howitzer, number 3 had another Jeep, number 4 had a Jeep trailer with ammunition, and they were supposed to follow the leader and go in as a team. Once we landed, number 2 was supposed to land close to number 1 so they could hook up. Jeep would pick up the gun. Number 3 would follow, and number 4 would follow because it had the trailer full of ammunition. You had to go in as a team.
The operation caught the Germans by surprise. An air armada of that size swooping in during broad daylight was uncommon. During the interrogation of a German officer captured during Varsity, he said he was greatly surprised by the speed with which the 2 airborne divisions had landed their troops, explaining that their sudden appearance had a shattering effect on the greatly outnumbered defenders. By nightfall, all of the major objectives of the Allies were completely successful. Over 1,500 German soldiers were taken as prisoners of war.
We headed down a road, and we got separated because of the small arms fire. And I finally came into a little farm area where they had a stone wall about 3 feet high. And standing behind this wall was a friend of mine by the name of Bill Stone, who I'd gone through training with him. And he called me by name and said, "Hey, George, come over here." Standing next to him was a general officer. I had never been that close to a general officer in my life. And he was in our landing zone with no troops, no aid, no maps, no nothing. So, Bill Stone says, "Hey George, where's your map?" I said, "Map? Damn it, I left the map in the glider." Because I was in a hurry to get out of there. They were shooting at us. And I forgot about the map. I was going on memory. And the general says, "Well, Lieutenant," he says, "I appreciate if you'd go back and pick up that map and bring it back to me because I have no map." So I said, "Yes, sir." And I turned around and headed back, took a shortcut to my glider. As I was walking through the hedgerows, out come these two Germans with their hands up, saying, "Comrade, comrade!" Well, I wasn't about to shoot them. I didn't know what to do with them. I said, "Come on with me. Come in the air. Come with me." So I marched them out to my glider so I could pick up the map. While I was approaching the glider, here comes another airborne guy, and I said, "Hey, buddy, do me a favor. Hold your gun on these guys while I take their picture."
Operation Varsity was the last time the gliders would be used in a large-scale airborne operation. By the end of the war, the U.S. military had built 14,612 gliders and trained approximately 6,000 glider pilots. Following World War II, the United States military maintained only one regiment of gliders, and by 1953, glider operations were deleted from the U.S. Army's capabilities. During the Korean conflict, the helicopter would evolve, becoming the main source for troop and supply distribution, rendering the glider for military use obsolete. What began with World War II would also end with it. What we are left with is a snapshot of history, an amazing tale of courage, bravery, and a fading legend.
It took a lot of skill to fly like a B-17 or a B-24, a 4-engine bomber. It took a lot of skill to fly a P-51, but I honestly think that some of the most skilled pilots were the ones who piloted the glider craft during the Second World War.
I think that you could say that it did what it was supposed to do in the time it was supposed to be, you know. I think it was one of those things designed or designated to be a one-time deal, and it served its purpose.
They had big plans for the glider after World War II for continuing its role in airborne operations. However, certainly yes, by the eve of the Korean War and with the advent of more powerful engines and helicopters, the glider program came to an end.
We saw so much destruction and so many deaths that you just, you know, you try to get until you get in the later years, you know, it just doesn't, you try to put it out of your mind. I guess that's the way with most of them.
These guys created a viable military weapon and used it very effectively to advance our cause during World War II tremendously, and did their job as well as could be expected. And they, like everybody else in the war, they deserve to be remembered for what they did. So that's why we're here.
After the war, the men who flew gliders returned to their towns, their families, and their everyday lives. 20% of the men who flew gliders during the war were either killed or wounded in battle. The 110th Congress passed a resolution honoring the brave soldiers who flew gliders during World War II. It states,
honoring the heroic services and sacrifices of the 6,500 glider pilots of the United States Army Air Forces during World War II. Whereas the use of gliders during World War II provided an innovative method of transporting troops and equipment behind enemy lines. Whereas the United States Army Air Forces began training glider pilots in 1942, eventually training approximately 6,500 men. Whereas glider pilots exhibited exceptional valor by landing behind enemy lines in unarmed gliders. Whereas in Operation Overlord on June 6, 1944, glider pilots took part in the Battle of Normandy, the largest combined airborne and seaborne invasion in history, carrying troops of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and their equipment to landing areas behind enemy lines. Whereas in Operation Market Garden, the largest glider operation of World War II, which took place in Holland on September 17, 1944, glider pilots carried their usual cargo of troops and heavy equipment, thereby providing cover for an attempt to clear a road to Berlin. Whereas in Operation Varsity, which took place at the Rhine Crossing on March 24, 1945, more than 1,300 glider pilots took part in their final European mission, delivering a fatal blow to Axis forces. Whereas many glider pilots sacrificed their lives during the course of these missions, now, therefore, be it resolved by the House of Representatives that Congress honors the heroic service and sacrifice of the 6,500 glider pilots of the United States Army Air Forces during World War II, and urges the people of the nation to remember and teach future generations about the contributions and sacrifices that glider pilots and all veterans have made to and for the nation.